Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the limits of progressivism. So, the last two lessons have been about all the achievements that were made between 1895 and 1920 in the name of progress, government as an agency of good. As we warm up, I want you to consider the following things. Make a list. Think of all that was accomplished during the Progressive era in terms of legal changes. What were the laws that were created to make a more fair and equitable system? Which ways do we see democratic participation increasing, being extended? For example, something like the 19th Amendment certainly helped women nationwide be able to participate in elections, but what else was going on to make the people's voice more readily heard? And then the last item is the people who successfully brought attention to society's problems. So those muckrakers, who were our progressive presidents. All of that should be in our mind as we go on with today's lecture. And our focus is primarily going to be about African Americans in the Progressive era. If you've paid attention to the last two presentations, we have focused on the white middle class, primarily women in terms of the origins of the progressive movement, but also the agenda, the people whose ends were best served. And these were all noble things like regulating industry, trying to break down the monopolies, creating a monetary policy that seemed to be more functional for the country as a whole. Certainly the changes that we've made to the Constitution. However, if you think about it, we didn't talk about African Americans. And if we remember from our earlier presentations, for most African Americans, life between 1877 and certainly through the good part of the 1960s was based in this principle, one upheld by the Supreme Court, of separate but equal. So that's not to say that African Americans weren't progressive and trying to create progressive endeavors for themselves, but that's going to be a trajectory separate from what the majority white population was achieving in that time period. Also consider that if we can see such great achievements in terms of our law and democratization for certain people, why wasn't that extended to all people in the United States? So to backtrack a little bit, if we think about Unit 5, we learned about the Civil War amendments, these great changes that came to our Constitution after the Civil War between 1865 and 1870, like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. We know that Reconstruction was important. Institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau, we had Civil Rights Act, we had lots of opportunities based in enforcement. There was a military occupation of the former 11 states of the Confederacy, but that ultimately ends in 1877 with what we call the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. But that election of 1876, the Republican Party wins it nationally by making a promise that Reconstruction can finally go away. And we see a return to that solid South, that white-dominated democratic policies of that time period. There were disparities. If we look between how African Americans and whites were living, not just simply in the South, but across the country, there was significant difference. But let's focus on the former states of the Confederacy for a moment. Economically, sharecropping is going to prevail. Why? Because the vast majority of formerly enslaved people, they had freedom, but they had no money. They didn't have tools. They didn't have land. And that economic relationship, which kept African Americans for an extended period of time subservient, furthermore, to their white landowners, continued on. And the crop lien system made it very challenging to try to extricate oneself from that relationship. Educationally, because of these separate but not so equal school systems, a good number of African Americans didn't have what was considered compulsory education of the time. For middle class families, the expectation was your child would go to school until they reached adulthood. For working class people, it might be age 12. But for the poor, and certainly for African Americans, in some cases, there was no school at all. School systems typically in southern states were set up by county. The funding was very different for those school systems. And so you might have a county that had 10 schools for white students, but a single school for African American students, and it could be 20 miles away. So it was quite typical to find relatively low education, if in some cases outright illiteracy, in large areas of the American South. Socially, obviously, the rise of segregation that's happening following Reconstruction becomes the law of the land in 1896 with Plessy v. Ferguson. We also see that legally, lynching is prevalent and it's not prosecuted. And again, lynching is the extra legal murder of an individual. Not only are we going to see this amongst the Black population, but we're also going to see it extend to Jewish populations in the South, particularly in the Atlanta area in the early 20th century. And then politically, how do we disenfranchise people? Literacy tests, poll taxes, until 1910, grandfather clauses even. So all of these things are still going on in the progressive era. We're seeing great change, democratization, but not for all people. And we really have sort of two leaders within the African American community in the progressive era. Booker T. Washington, if you remember, was a formerly enslaved man who, upon getting his freedom and acquiring education, began his life's work of creating higher education institutions for African Americans. His Tuskegee Institute in Alabama will be integral to providing education not only for engineering and medicine, but also other professions as well. And he became a leader, particularly in terms of African Americans who were attempting to bridge this relationship with whites. You can see this picture of Booker T. Washington and the gentlemen who are the original seed money to his Tuskegee Institute, including Andrew Carnegie there. He spoke often about this idea of accommodation, most famously in what's known as the Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895, but believed, and perhaps because he was living in the deep South of the day, that African Americans would not be able to peacefully acquire true parity with the greater white population. And so accommodation was a manner in which African Americans could currently try to seek economic advancement through institutions like Tuskegee, but they would then defer any kind of political or social advancement. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a contemporary of Booker T. Washington, he had a very different view. And part of it may have been that he was raised in the North. He was one of the first African Americans to graduate, earned a PhD from Harvard University. And his view was that one cannot have economic advancement if you don't have the social and political equality already. And so, therefore, all three things need to be immediately addressed. He started with some like minded people. In Niagara, New York, with what was called the Niagara Movement in 1905, where they created essentially a policy statement based on these ideas, ultimately becoming an organization known as the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the NAACP, part of its mission was to fundraise and to use that money to work with the courts to essentially take points of law relative to the Constitution and, where possible, seek legal advancement. That equality under the law, social equality, economic equality was all going to come from the interpretation of the Constitution itself and the laws that currently existed that limited African American participation. The NAACP ultimately will be responsible for funding lots of lawsuits that we'll look at as we continue on with our study of the 20th century, but probably most famously the Brown cases, what overturned separate but equal in education in the United States in 1954. The NAACP helped provide the legal assistance and the money required to take that case through the courts and ultimately prevail at the Supreme Court. W.B. Du Bois also was integral in producing one of the first African American magazines, and we've talked about mass media and the prominence of the magazine in the late 19th, early 20th century. His magazine, The Crisis, is still the magazine of the NAACP. His focus was to have a journal that could present what African American leaders, business owners, thinkers, scientists were doing currently and highlight those achievements. He also, like the journals of the day, wanted to focus on some issue of social change through a long form investigative essay. So, much like what the muckrakers were doing amongst the white populations and immigrant populations of the day. And then the last piece was to focus on the art, the music, the cultural contributions of African Americans were making currently at that time as well. And short fiction would have been included in this as well. So he was attempting to take what was this idea of progress over time, which Booker T. Washington had. And Du Bois said we have to be doing things to make this an immediate goal and achieved as soon as possible. If we are willing to put it off, it'll never come to be. So we have to demand it now, and we have to be strategic in the manner that we achieve this. So the picture I'm showing you on my screen, I'm going to give you another version of it here in a moment, but I just want you to look at the men and young boys who are in the crowd. If you notice, they're looking back. It seems like they're looking at us, but in a sense, we're in the presence of where the photographer would have been. This image has been altered, so something has been removed from it, and you may notice that our crowd is gathered on two sides. So is there something in between here? They're looking back at us, but what exactly are we looking at? Lynching was something that was commonplace. Did it happen every single day or every week? No, but it did happen not just in the American South, but as far north as places like Indiana, well into the 1930s. In the American South, it'll continue on well into the 1950s. And that lynching issue was one that you would think the muckrakers would address, but they didn't. Even when it affected what we might consider white today or some form of whiteness. But this gentleman was Jewish, and he was hung, and his body ultimately dismembered in 1912. The men who are posing with this body are posing with it. Certainly, some of them are a little surprised to see the photographer and they turn, maybe just to see if they're being included in the picture. But that was not an uncommon phenomenon. Lynching was not rare and it was not secret. They were public events. People handed out cards, took photographs and souvenirs of the victims. Why we make this an issue with this particular point in our lesson is because lynching was a problem, in the same as child labor, the inadequacy of proper hygiene and sanitation in America's cities, certainly the problems we saw with mass production of food, with things like the jungle, political machines, and the excesses of monopolistic practice. However, this was not an issue that white journalists of the day highlighted. The first major cataloging of this phenomenon will be by a woman named Ida B. Wells, who's African American. She will publish her book, though, as we are on this eve of the muckrakers and the beginnings of the progressive era. And she wanted to make sure that people understood that many of the excuses made for why lynching happened were one, inadequate. One of the things that unfortunately appealed to some white audiences across the nation was simply that lynching was legitimate because it was stopping African American men who had a propensity to rape and harm white women. And she showed that the vast majority of lynching victims were actually accused of other crimes, including theft and stealing. And even those who had been even convicted in a court of law before their lynching, that they had committed some criminal offense that was sexual in nature, there was never actual evidence that tied the person who will ultimately be victimized by the lynching to the action that they've been accused of. Lynching also seemed to occur during economic downturns, and you can see here that when we see the price of cotton is low in a given year, we see the number of lynchings quite high. We begin to see that dropping again in a relationship where the number of lynchings fall precipitously when we see the price of cotton per pound go up. And so she wanted to make sure that people understood that lynching, unfortunately, was common, it was ever increasing, and it needed to be prosecuted. For every lynching that happened and no criminal repercussions came to those who did the lynching, this would be a practice that would continue on and on. The pictures I showed you before, they are part of an artistic exhibit that helps people understand not simply lynching, that who was victimized, but that ultimately there were people who acted, large groups of people who acted and participated in these, even as giving just simply witness. So if you're interested in those, you can find those at the following addresses, and also other exhibits that are currently underway that highlight lynching, unfortunately, as a cultural norm in the height of the Progressive era. So as we close out, I just want you to make sure that we're really thinking about the extent to which the progressive reformers and the federal government were really effective in bringing about reform at the national level. They certainly were in particular instances. But as we go through this course, we have to keep thinking about the fact that for all the change that the progressives want to bring about, particularly that cohort that is white and middle class, that there are people that are forgotten. Besides those issues which they won't deal with in terms of things like integration, we also see there's great limits being put on immigration at the time, social Darwinism, eugenics. All of these are part of the ideologies of the people who are looking to reform and improve society. And it's part of the reason why they felt certain people would not be included. So again, as we close out our understanding of Unit 6, remember we're looking at it in two parts. We're looking at first the Gilded Age and the excesses that come from an unregulated economy and the repercussions of quick societal change. And then we're going to look again at the Progressive era and the solutions, and some very important solutions to problems in American society. But never forget what wasn't accomplished and the work that still has to be done.